we're recording this chat between myself and Ross is here. And
yes, hi there. My name's Ross, and I was born in Australia. I'm 58 years old, and I'm a Christian, and I've been living by faith for about 38 years since I turned 20.
We're here kind of a follow-up to another video that I did on Voice in the Desert, which is a channel on YouTube that I came across about a year ago, just about a year ago. And so after we started talking, I asked Ross if he would mind doing what we're doing right now, which is having a discussion. We're trying to do it in kind of an interview format, but I have talked to Ross enough before we started to do this recording. I trust him completely to be able to express exactly what's on his mind about this. Your testimony when you met the Lord, I don't know if you want to add that in there, but that'd be fine with me. But you know how you came to be a believer, you know, and
Yeah. I'm ready to start at the beginning and give you a bit of background on that. Well, I was brought up by my parents in a Methodist church. My grandparents were fairly serious believers, but I can't say that my parents were. They were of that generation that left off going to church. However, my mother did send me to Sunday school in the Methodist church, and that's how I got my beginning understanding of Jesus. And I used to enjoy going to Sunday school. I can say even from the earliest times that I remember, I believed in Jesus, and I can't explain why that is. I just did. So I was in the Methodist church until I was about 16. And at that point, I started questioning things more as an adult, and I used to wonder why all the young people were leaving the church, and there didn't seem to be anything holding them there, and they were just leaving and going out and into the worldly life, so to speak. And I kind of thought that faith in Jesus is much more valuable than that. I went to, the Christian camps and prayed to ask Jesus into my heart at that point, and I thought I was pretty sincere about that. But I think my understanding was growing from the childlike understanding to the adult understanding. But at least at that point, around about 16, I was I couldn't find any real direction in the Methodist church. There didn't seem to be any strong teaching in the church. It seemed just very wishy-washy, and I felt directionless. About this time, I was out riding my bike, and I passed by a meeting hall where there was a Pentecostal meeting going on inside, and I was curious because these people were singing and clapping, and they seemed very happy about their faith, whereas the Methodist church seemed to be very funeral-like. So I went in, and they told me about the Holy Spirit, and that was their main thing. I could receive the Holy Spirit. I could have the joy of the Holy Spirit in my heart. I could speak in tongues. So that all seemed pretty good to me. So I came back that night and I got water baptized, and lo and behold, I spoke in tongues and I felt the power of the Holy Spirit on me. And I was about 17, and I did feel a real joy in my heart, and I was very excited about that initial experience. But I suppose I was still a teenager at that point, and I was in that Pentecostal church for about 5 years, and the preaching was mainly from the King James Version of the Bible. But as I became more and more towards an adult, I guess I was starting to get in a questioning an adult mind as well. At that point, I was also continuing my studies. I was going to university. I was studying music. I was going to become a music teacher. I was enjoying that course, but as I got to the end of the course, I was 20 years old. I reached another crisis point where I started questioning, well, why am I placing such a high value on materialism? Jesus is returning. There's talk of nuclear war. There's but all the people in my church seem very middle class, and they're all buying houses and in home ownership and are materialistically occupied. And I started to see some contradictions, and I didn't have a strong desire to become a music teacher either. But I didn't at that point see any other option. So I was hitting that crisis point at that point, and that's when I bumped into David McKay and his family, who were evangelizing on the street, and they started showing me scriptures about living by faith and how that I could be a full-time missionary. And I was very impressed. I'd never really been shown scriptures like that before, not in the Pentecostal church or the Methodist church, although the Methodist church did talk about missionaries. The Pentecostal church didn't talk about missionaries at all. They didn't have any. They taught you should get a job and work, and if you've got time to preach on the weekend, well, then that's what you should do. So this is all very new to me, and I started reading the Gospels again, and I was very excited by those scriptures. So that's how I led up to me meeting Dave McKay and his family at that point. But that caused another crisis in the Pentecostal church, because I started questioning the teaching of the church, and they didn't like the things I was saying, even though I was just quoting Jesus. And I was kind of shocked at how they were fighting against what Jesus said. And I found myself excommunicated, or stood down from fellowship, as they call it, for entertaining different ideas to what the leadership there. I began to understand more from an adult view of how church politics goes on, and how people are controlled in particular churches. And this was a church with very kind of strict guidelines about members and what they should do and not do. And I'd hit the nail on the head, so to speak, as far as the problems going on politically in that church and the amount of control that the pastor has over the members. They were also a church that believed that unless you were in their church and unless you spoke in tongues, you weren't saved. And so they had both those kind of doctrines that keep people in one particular church because of those teachings. Anyway, I found myself excommunicated from the church as a result of just asking too many questions. So that caused me to move closer to Dave and his family, and it wasn't long before I decided that I wanted to become a full-time missionary and work with them and learn how to live by faith.
I said in the beginning that I had come across Dave on YouTube under Voice in the Desert. I found out that he had another channel called Endtime Survivors, I think, where he's known as Brother Dave. And I had kind of gotten a relationship. He started inviting me to what he called specialized meetings, where not the entire public was invited, but a group that he had chosen to participate in these live chats on YouTube. And my wife was invited, and we went in there and we were listening to what Dave had to say. And I noticed that it started to kind of, he was moving in a little bit different direction than I'd heard on his videos that were out for the public to hear. And also in our emails, he started to move through, and he was offering me a position of leadership, is what he called it. He originally, he just asked me to come in and share testimony about what it was like to be out on the road and what it was like to give up everything and walk off and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what kept me interested. And until it never happened. This kept not happening. Somehow that came to a point where when he realized that I wasn't as interested in leadership as he had, I think, assumed, he kind of wrote a scathing email. And in that email was something that he said that damaged my wife's psyche or soul, or it was a condemnation. And I'm not going to say particularly what it is yet, maybe later, but and I'm not here to attack this man. But after talking to others and especially Ross, I could understand why Ross was talking about this. I could see why he was trying to make public some of these things that were hidden to the public, because he had a lot of experience with it. He's seen a lot over the years. And
I've known Dave for over 30 years. I have a personal experience of his character and the way he thinks, and some fairly clear insight, I think, from God about how to understand the situation with him and what's currently happening regarding the YouTube channels that he's created. Carrying on from when I took my decision to leave university, sell all my possessions and hit the road with Dave and his family. I did that as unto God. I wasn't doing it as unto a man. I was doing it in obedience to Jesus, and I was genuinely excited with what I saw in the teaching of Jesus. And I was excited about the idea that, like Jesus sent his disciples out 2 by 2 with no money, no food, no change of clothes, and God would feed them. To me, I saw a future for myself and most people in general. They're stuck with the house and the mortgage and their job, and they got no time for the gospel. They got no time for missionary work. They're completely stuck serving mammon. And I saw this as good news. Good news was I could have my time free to serve God. I didn't have to be a slave. But since I never experienced anything like that, trying to live outside the system, and Dave had accounted about his experiences with his family of faith experiences, this was really exciting to me, and I wanted to experience that for myself. So what happened was I ended up going up to a little farmhouse in the country where Dave and his family were living. Most of the kids were teenagers by then, 4 kids. They were paying something like $5 a week rent in this farmhouse. So, but I think at that time there was a genuine move of the Spirit, because it wasn't long after I arrived that other young people about my age arrived as well. And that was all very spontaneous. So very quickly it wasn't just Dave's family and myself, but about 15 people altogether, so that we had to find some bigger accommodation, which we did by moving to another location. And in the early days, the young people involved were very idealistic. Some of them had never been to church, and some of them had. It was quite an interesting mix of non-church young people and church young people. But we were all trying to figure out the teachings of Jesus and the Gospels, and we'd go on these faith outreaches without any money, and we'd come back very excited because we didn't starve to death, and we got to minister to people along the way, and often we were hitchhiking or just walking, whatever happened. We had some great experiences in those times. I think in those times Dave himself was also much more democratic than he is now, and he was willing to listen to the members of the community, and there's more discussion about and voting on decisions.
Yeah, that's where I was going to ask, because, and I heard you mention before in the conversation we had in the beginning, I did ask if it's what this was, is this going to be like the church has, with the hierarchy and the pastor at the top, and then whatever the bishops and the elders and all that under however that works. I don't really know, but I wasn't wanting to be involved in anything like that. And Dave assured me that no, this is just going to be a move of the Lord. We're going to let the Holy Spirit do it all. And that's exactly the way you saw it too, right?
Yeah, that was the impression that I was given. And I think Dave was sincerely trying to do that at that point in time. As time went on, though, people started maturing, and they started questioning Dave's decisions more. And I think what was happening was that Dave was feeling that things weren't always going the way he wanted them to, because the vote was going in other directions. And I think this unnerved him, because before he could persuade the group to go in a certain direction because he was good with words and very persuasive and so forth. But now he was finding it wasn't so easy to steer the group in the way he wanted to. But I will mention that we did agree on a group name, which was the Jesus Christians at that time. And that name stuck with the group for probably 25 years. There's a website called the Jesus Christians. It's still there. It has all the original ideas. And most of the stuff is written by Dave. Some by other people, including myself, are on that page. But I think that Dave began to realize that democracy wasn't serving him in the way he wanted, and somehow he was losing control. And this was an issue for him personally, that he wasn't dealing with within his own spirit. And so this was leading to more problems. And he seemed to be becoming more authoritarian in his attitudes. And there was then the internet arrived at about this point as well, and the internet is people started moving away, so there wasn't one central group either. There were people in different places, so it wasn't always easy to have a meeting and discuss things. And anyone who's tried to go on a chat room will find that it's not easy having a democratic discussion with a chat room. Maybe the newer audio chat rooms are easier to have conference calls and things, but we hadn't discovered those. So this was leading up to, we did a lot of different things over the years, and some of them we were getting negative feedback from. I'm
interested.
Go ahead now, because I'll run my train of thought.
Okay. Well, I wanted to know about what the time frame was. This like 20 years in or 10 years in, or?
Yeah, I think the problems started coming at around the 20 year mark. We just done a highlight where we'd had projects running in India, because we were living as a community in Australia, and we were sharing possessions and things like this, and so there was a lot of money left over, and the group decided that we should take that money and use it for projects in India, charitable projects. This wasn't advertised. We weren't fundraising for it. This was our own. And instead of giving that money to, say, something like World Vision, we would actually send people over to India, maybe 2 or 4 members at a time, and they would set up a project and do it. This was very rewarding at the time. One of the most enjoyable parts of my experience was working in India. Yep.
I don't think we've discussed this before, but how was the money generated?
Well, a lot of it was just by, at that point, we were creating our own tracts, as we put them, sort of small pamphlets. Dave's son was an artist. He would illustrate. And these were turned into little booklets. They were distributed on the street, and members would ask for donations for those booklets, and the donations came in. So there was an income stream fairly consistently from that.
So you say it was fairly well received then, in where you're at in Australia?
Generally speaking, we would get mail from the tracks, and people coming in making inquiries on a fairly consistent basis. But as I say, we were also, because we were living simply and we were living as a community, we were saving money, and we had to decide what we were actually going to do with that. And the India project was the main overseas project that we decided on, and myself and many other people went over for 6 months at a time, and we would set up charitable projects, and we had a community center, we had a health clinic, we had a English teaching, street cleanup, toilet. You name it, we did it, and we really enjoyed it. And Dave wasn't always there. This was the initiative of the other members, and Dave was not there all the time. He was in Australia or other places. So we had quite a bit of. There was always a bit of freedom to do and initiate things as well. It wasn't all total control, so to speak.
Yeah, I was interested in that. We had discussed that before, and I was interested in how you got, so initially, you just sent out, I guess, kind of like missionaries to India, right?
Yep.
And you guys would start doing exactly what you were doing in Australia and just doing it in India, right?
Yep. Yep. There was at least one or two times that I went on faith outreaches in India where we did rent a house in India. Of course, it's very cheap to rent for using, what you call Western money. The exchange rate is very favorable. So, we're able to rent a place very cheaply, but also we're also experimenting to say, well, okay, God will provide. India's a poor country, so to speak. Um, how is it going to go if we just walk out the door and go ministering with no money? And what is that going to be like? And I did that twice, and in fact, it worked better than it did in Australia because I believe it's what Jesus said. He said, "A prophet's not respected in his own country." So when you go abroad, and you're obviously if you're a Westerner in India, you stick out like a sore thumb. There's no hiding your fact that you're surrounded by a sea of different faces, and uh, people invite you in. There's a culture of hospitality, and if you're a foreigner, and they see it as an honor to invite you into their house and take care of you. And so we'd walk into a village and we'd offer to help clean up the village or do things for the village, and somebody would invite us to stay in their house, and we would stay there for several days. Um, Now, they were amazing experiences, even better than the faith outreaches that we'd had in Australia.
Yeah, I can understand that. I mean, obviously I'm from America, got a little bit of hillbilly accent, and I noticed that just someone has a British accent here, you automatically think they're smarter than you, no more than you. And so yeah, and yeah, you're always trying to help out. Yeah, I can see exactly how that would
Mm-hmm.
work, and that may have been plus you guys, you learn to keep a low overhead,
Yeah.
obviously, in
Well,
Australia, and that was working.
yeah. And, one of the key ideas that I learned from Dave at that time was the idea of working for love and not for money as your motive, your inner motive. This really liberated me personally in the idea that everything I did, whether I was helping somebody, I wasn't doing it so I could earn money or get money to survive. I was doing it because I loved people, because I cared about them, and I just wanted to help them. And I wasn't concerned about what I would get back from the transaction. So everything became helping. Everything became caring. Didn't matter what it was that I was doing. I was doing it out of love. I found that extremely liberating to not think about, getting food in return or getting anything in
Right.
return. That was God's business. That was not my business.
Yeah,
Seek
you
ye
were
first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you. It's
right.
extremely liberating. Uh, I became enthusiastic to actually work to help people, rather than the attitude of, well, I'm not going to do anything unless you pay me, which is the system mindset, or if I'm not getting paid, this is my free time, so I'll just sit around and do nothing all day. No, that's not the kingdom of God.
Yeah, I've experienced that when anytime it's like the Amish where I'm from, they have
Mm-hmm.
a barn raising,
Yeah,
and it if you're building barns for money, it's just hard work, you
yeah,
know. But if you're doing it to help somebody, a neighbor,
mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah,
fun. It's
yeah,
it's like
yep.
not work at all when you're doing it like that.
No, work is no longer work when you're doing it for love and God.
I can see that. I really can.
Mm.
So, all right. So everything. Let me recap where we've gone so far. You guys, you got something going on in Australia that's that's well received, and now you have leftover. You take the leftover income, and you say, well, let's spread this around. I'm sure with prayer or whatever, you saw a need in India, you took it there, and even though the Indian people were poor, it was easy to keep the overhead low because there wasn't enough, lots of cheap places to be. And then they were receptive to it even more so because they respected you even more because you weren't Indian, right?
Yeah, so that's right.
It was working, and everything was going along good in India. And then what happened next?
Well, we're reaching about the year 2000 now, so it's about 20 years in. We had a big India project where almost everyone from Australia came over, the team, and we were working on this one big project. It was probably the highlight of the community at its peak, if you like. But the project was mainly managed by one guy and Dave's son. They were the main sort of like elders or leaders of that project in India, and we were all coordinating with them. We had the clinic, we had a children's playground in a slum, and everything seemed to be, and there was a lot of media interest from the Indian side. They were coming and doing interviews, and really Dave was on the sidelines of this. He wasn't really the front man at all. It was his son and this other guy. But what I started to notice was that Dave didn't like the fact that he wasn't getting the attention anymore. That we're the younger members, if you like, were actually becoming successful spiritually, not because they had an ego thing. They were just doing what God wanted them to do. But this was starting to cause friction with Dave over, and this was sort of an undercurrent because it wasn't like overtly, the situation, but it was just started to become a symptom. So we reached that peak, and then decision was taken to shut down the India thing altogether and go back to Australia on a sort of a high point. Some of Kevin and Dave's son and this other guy who had married a local Indian girl, well, they both had married Indian girls by this point, they were happy to stay on, but Dave wanted the whole thing shut down, and I probably think that was because he was starting to get envious of their success. But anyway, it did shut down. Everyone went back to Australia, and then more tension started to develop between Dave and his son and this other guy, and it finally led to a complete breakdown of communication, and Kevin and his son had a complete falling out of the community. We weren't all in the one place at that point, so there were people overseas. I was in India. Dave and his son were back in Australia. There was a meeting, including the other guy and another couple to witness. But basically, at that point, Dave was arguing that he should be the group's apostle, that he should have more an overall, like Paul, if you like, who is sort of like a moving between the various teams in different locations, but that he had a kind of a role and authority. And Kevin was arguing that for a more independent, autonomous style of managing the situation. So it was the tension was really between these two different kinds of ways of using power. The authority of the apostle type, who's sort of like has the authority over all the other groups, and Kevin, who is arguing more for the independent team. You know, the church in the local area is responsible for their own communities, and there's a more what do you say, cooperation between the other groups, the other churches. But basically everyone's more independent, and there is no central authority.
Okay. All right. So let me see if I got the picture here.
Mm-hmm.
It starts in Australia. You go to India. It's doing better in India than it was in Australia. Dave is still in Australia. You guys are having fun, it sounds like, and things are going swimmingly in India. Now, how did that work? Did people start to come in and want to be part of it, or you mentioned other churches and other communities?
Well, there are already people moving out to different places. There was India. Another couple decided they wanted to live in the UK. They already had citizenship there, so they wanted to start up a community in London and England. They did that. Some people went to the US. Dave went back to the US on visits because he was from there anyway. He moved with his family because he believed that America was going downhill and he didn't want to raise his children in the USA, and he migrated with his wife to Australia in the 1970s and became an Australian citizen. So there were outreaches, if you like, going to various parts of the world, and that's how, as I said, democracy in that sense became more difficult because people were in different locations. Dave's solution to this was to try and create a more central command structure, whereas the group was maturing and the long-term members were arguing also for a more independent, adult-like relationship with Dave rather than a parent-to-child kind of relationship between the elder and the younger. So this was the tension that was building, and as I said, the confrontation occurred between Dave and his son over this. Led to Dave falsely accusing them of wanting to steal the money that was reserved in a bank account to go to India. This was a false accusation. There was no substance to the accusation whatsoever. But Kevin and the other guy were so upset by that accusation, which Dave never withdrew, that it led to a permanent separation. Kevin and his family left, and the other guy's family left, and in fact half the group left over that in terms of numbers.
So everything was going along good, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was starting to expand naturally. It sounds like you experienced very, very much like what Paul was experiencing, starting churches or assemblies, and then moving on and letting those assemblies go ahead and multiply themselves.
Grow naturally, yeah.
Right. And I don't think, we know after Paul got in prison, he wrote the letters that we're all familiar with, and it seemed like he was trying to direct them from prison. Yeah. But I'm encouraged by what you're saying, because I see that would have generated naturally if it was working, if it kept the same pattern. You come from Australia, you start in India, the Indians would have taken it to be respected, probably taken it out of India or to another place, and then that would have just kept spreading. That's amazing to me.
Yeah.
Never seen like that.
Yeah.
But because the money was being held in a central location and under Dave's control or under someone else's control, that became an issue.
Well, I think it was just the excuse. That was just a way of upsetting the apple cart completely. And it was just the false accusation was there to destroy the communication completely. It was a deliberate act, and I wasn't there at the time. I was in India, but when I heard about it, I said, Dave never retracted that false accusation.
Right.
There was no evidence for it, but it led to a permanent rift between him and his son and the other guy.
So let me ask
you. Dave never apologized for making any false accusations. But it wasn't the first time he'd made false accusations either. Because it's a kind of a technique that you can use to put other people on the back foot. An offensive technique.
Let me ask you real quick. I don't want to throw you off, get you too far off, so hang on there.
No, go on.
I'm fascinated by this. This is something that you and I have discussed. What do you think, in your opinion, because you said Dave wanted the Indian to try to shut it down. How do you shut down something that is almost biologically and by nature starting to expand? If he didn't, why didn't he just withdraw his interest or withdraw? If it had been allowed to grow naturally, it seems to me like you wouldn't need any central figurehead.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that was the argument that his son was making at the time. The India base did continue in a smaller version. So it wasn't shut down completely even then, but, so what I'm saying is that, Kevin and this other guy were looking after the Australian base at that point. Dave was moving around from different countries, trying to coordinate things. But, there was a lot of goodwill and trust. Well, that trust was completely destroyed by that. And then, Dave announced to the other 50%, mostly of the group, that they were not to speak directly to these guys, but that he would be the only one to speak to them because he considered them to be a threat to the group. I was in India at the time, and unfortunately I accepted that explanation. But I felt uneasy about it, because it was unprecedented that people should be excommunicated, that you should stop speaking to them altogether, and it gave Dave a lot of extra power because he was controlling the communication directly, and everyone had to go through him if they wanted to communicate anything. So this was the kind of thing that was starting to happen. I had misgivings I felt very depressed, sad about the whole split at that point. But being in India, I gave Dave the benefit of the doubt over the whole thing. But from that point on, things became more authoritarian as far as Dave making decisions was concerned. And this was to come to another head about 10 or 15 years later, in the group's history, which we're talking about 2010. When the next sort of, problem arose. So the problem didn't go away. It was just things were heading in a more authoritarian direction. Dave was making more and more decisions that weren't being challenged or questioned. And he created, in 2000, he created the Survivors book, which is the Endtime book, which is a fiction story about the end time. And the group was printing those and distributing those at that point as well. Yeah.
So Dave was back in the States by then?
Well, no, he was moving around. Sometimes he was in Australia somewhere, and sometimes he was elsewhere. But most of the time he was in Australia. But it was generally accepted that he was the founder. We were instructed to never call him the leader, but pretty much he was the de facto leader. But in order to avoid him being accused of being a cult leader or a personality cult, we were instructed never to call him the leader, but the founder, who was just sort of benevolently looking over the flock, if you like, and coordinating the various teams in various locations.
And that was done by phone or computer, or how were you guys communicating?
Mostly computer, sometimes by phone if it was an emergency.
So extensive use of the internet?
Yeah. Yeah. We became more and more, and Dave was a prolific letter writer, writing letters over the emails and expecting people to send in reports and all that kind of thing. That was being done all the time at that point. And he was sending a lot of instructions to people via the internet, emails, and sometimes it was not easy to keep up with the volume of writing that was expected sometimes to various groups or whatever. But that was generally the way things were going. But most of Dave's writings communications weren't advice. They were pretty much expected to be followed.
Okay. Now, are we coming up on 2010 yet?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you ready to go there?
Yeah, ready to go to that. At that time, 2010, there was what you might call a reunion organized. I mean, Dave was a good organizer. That's one of his good points. He could coordinate and organize pretty well. So organized most people to come to Australia for a little holiday, if you like. So we all came together for what you might call a conference. But it wasn't a very happy kind of conference. This was Dave decided to tear strips off publicly off the couple from England who'd been pretty much pioneered the base there, and then he was publicly chewing them out in front of everybody else, which was not the way you were supposed to go about addressing people. According to Jesus' teaching about if you've got a problem with your brother, you're supposed to go to him privately, and if that doesn't work, you're supposed to, but it just led to Dave letting off steam at them. I was shocked at that point at how vehement he was being, but I was depressed myself at the time, and I was unable to come to anyone's defense or anything like that. I was just sort of watching this deterioration of relationships, and it was even worse than 2000. By what I was seeing. But this was all leading up to Dave's new idea that the group should go underground and disappear, that he was going to announce on the internet that the Jesus Christians had disbanded, that there would no longer be the Jesus Christians, and everybody was doing their own thing. But at the same time, he was saying that this wasn't the reality; it was fake. It was this was to throw off internet enemies that are trolls and people like that who were starting to criticize the group on the internet and so forth. And Dave was saying that it was, to protect the group from persecution, that we needed to go underground and change all the names and pretend that we didn't exist anymore. Well, the couple from England, who actually were back in England by that point because they got so chewed out that they left early and went back to England. And I was around, but this was just after the reunion that this announcement was made. We were called on the internet, and we were given basically orders from Dave that this had to be done now. And I said I had reservations about this move. I was concerned about being dishonest, about telling the public that we'd disbanded when we were doing no such thing. And I was cut out of the chat. I was just excommunicated from the chat for voicing an opinion. This had never happened to me before, and it was just, I was shocked. All of a sudden I was part of the discussion, and the next minute I was out. And I just stood there in front of the screen for about another 3 or 4 hours in the library, and I realized that I'd been cut out of the conversation, that they weren't going to talk to me anymore, and that Dave had literally disappeared. And I was on my own because I wasn't going to jump when he said so, and I dared to ask questions. I was just really, really shocked that he was going to do that to me. After all the time that I'd known him, there was just no respect at all. Or, it was either do what I say or I'm going to excommunicate you as well. And I was angry, I was shocked, and I didn't hear from him from about 6 months after that. There was no communication. And the website, now Jesus Christian website, announced that the group had disbanded, put a formal announcement up there. They even sent out an email about it to various contacts to just to make it clear. But yeah, from that point on, I knew I was totally on my own. I didn't know who was in communication with Dave and who wasn't, or who was in the group and who wasn't in the inner circle, so to speak.
You found out later, right? That it wasn't
it's just you. Losing all your friends in one stroke.
You found out that it wasn't just you that had been excommunicated, but probably none of the ones that had been excommunicated knew, right? That the others had been.
No. I had to try and contact people like the couple in London, and found out that they'd been cut off as well. And then we started talking about it, and we knew that Dave was lying publicly, but I mean, we couldn't talk to them because they weren't talking to us anymore. So I was in Australia, they were in London. We kept up communication, but we weren't getting communication from anyone else. Then a couple of months later, another older guy from London was disfellowshipped because Dave, via the email, he was separated from his wife. His wife wasn't a Christian. And they'd been separated for about 2 years or something, and he was an older guy, and he decided to join the group, but the wife was still in the family home. paying the mortgage. They had 2 daughters, adult daughters, that had moved away from home. But Dave decided to put the hard word on Alan, his name was, and said, you need to resolve your situation with your wife about your house, which they had a joint mortgage with, and you need to sort that out. Well, the story with Alan is even more shocking, and I don't want to go into that. It's another. I was even more shocked with what he did to Alan than I am with me.
Now, hang on though. I don't want to get too far into it either, but you said he had a mortgage on a house before he came into the group, or this is a senior member?
No, this is a newer member, but he was senior as in an older guy, probably towards retirement, almost retired. He had a mortgage with his wife, so he left the family home, but he left his wife in the family home, and they'd lived there all their life. And then after 2 years of being in the group, Dave put the hard word on Alan and said, you need to resolve this joint ownership of the house that you have with your wife. And the shocking thing was that basically Dave's instructions mounted to provoking his wife to divorce him, and therefore with the divorce proceedings the house would be had to be divided between the two of them in some way or another.
So it's forcing the sale of the house.
Forcing the sale of the house, yep. His wife, through her lawyer, wanted to keep the house because she'd been living in it all her life. She was an unbeliever. She wasn't a Christian. So she made an offer to take out a loan and pay Alan the money, which was not 50% of the property, but less, maybe 25% or something. But it would allow her to keep the family home, and that would be the settlement, basically. Otherwise, she would have to leave the house, and the house would have to be sold. Alan felt in his conscience that he should accept the offer, rather than continue fighting it out with lawyers who were gobbling up all the money anyway, which often happens in the UK particularly. It's not a clear-cut 50-50. However, Dave wouldn't accept that, and basically said you should continue fighting his wife with the lawyers and get 50% of his entitlement. And Alan said, I don't think in my conscience I can do that. And Dave said, well, then you can go back to your wife, and he was disfellowshipped for not forsaking all, as it was put to him. That he wasn't willing to forsake all. And so he was disfellowshipped for refusing Dave's order.
That's some rough treatment, that's for sure.
Oh, it was rough. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, the extremes that Dave was willing to go. And we know it was Dave instructing him, because Alan said it was via email. But the point is that if you're looking at the teachings of Christ on a subject like this, it says if someone takes you to law and asks for your coat, let him have your cloak as well, right? So we're talking about the guy's unbelieving wife. She's in other words, be generous, right? Don't sue the pants off the other guy. Or if they come with an offer, well, then be generous and let them have it. It's only a material thing. And but that wasn't good enough for Dave. He wanted the complete control over the situation and take as much money off Alan's unbelieving wife as he could get. Yeah. Instructing Alan to do that. And when Alan, in his conscience, wouldn't agree with it, they just kicked him out. So there was no room to have your own conscience. It was either Dave's way or the highway. Now, Dave had always been a bit like that, but this was like a guy on a rampage.